What's up, guys? What's up, guys? Nick with Peak. Our ZR2 Tubular Upper Control Arms are finally here. And we have a ZR2 here to install them on. While we're at it, wanted to go ahead and make an install video on our spacer lift as well as our two-piece lift kit. So we're going to show you both how they work, when you want to use them, when you don't. Regarding our arms, however, so they're tubular steel, powder coated. They come with Delrin bushing, so they're self-lubricating. They also have a tab welded on them for your brake line, so that way you don't have anything dangling and you don't have to try to move it elsewhere. Really well thought out. Looking forward to installing these on the truck, see how they perform, show you guys how to do it. As far as our kits are concerned, for the lift kits, we have our standard spacer kit. This will give you a true level. And then we also have, combined with that, we have two different versions of a lift kit. These are spring seat spacers, so they'll go underneath the spring seat. You have two different sizes, so you can get a 2-inch or a 2.25-inch lift to mate with our following blocks, which we should have in a couple weeks. So included in the kit, wanted to go over each component. So these are misalignment spacers and taper. This is what's going to connect your control arms to your spindle. These are the washers going between the ends of the joints and your stock shock towers. We have your Zerk fittings. Now these are Delrin, so they don't require a lot of maintenance, but we do add the fittings in case you do need to grease them, or if you do end up changing the bushings at some point, you can put different ones in and grease them that way. Also, we have included zip ties for the brake lines for those tabs. And always, before we get started, make sure you lift the vehicle up, take the wheel off, and get started on the suspension work. So one of the first things you want to do is disconnect the tie rod. It's 21 millimeter. You can use a socket, you can use an impact. We use an impact because we like to do things fast and loud. Just move that out of the way. Won't impede anything once you're done moving this stuff. Next, we'll move on to the top mounts. So 18 millimeter, I recommend a flex head wrench. It's a lot easier to get some of those back bolts, but there's 3 18 mils on here. Let's go ahead and start removing those. So the next thing you want to pull off is the lower end link mount to your lower control arm from your sway bar. It's an 18 millimeter. Again, you can use a socket or an impact. Just go ahead and remove that. So while you're underneath here, the lower shock bolts are 15 millimeter. Go ahead and remove those. So next thing we're going to do is remove the two 10 millimeter bolts holding in the wheel speed sensor. I recommend you can take these off with an impact, but I don't recommend you put them on with an impact. Once you have this done, move it out of the way, let it hang up freely in the back. So the next thing you want to do, you're going to remove the control arm. It's an 18 millimeter. You can use a socket, use a wrench. Make sure you support the entire spindle assembly with a jack. If you're on a lift, you can use a strap to go from end to end just to make sure it doesn't drop. You don't want to pull the brake lines, you don't want to pull the axle out. So we're going to support it, remove that 18 millimeter nut. So once that's free, you can start to lower your spindle assembly until you can remove the shock. Now that the assembly's out of the truck, if you want to just level the truck, all you need is this top mount spacer, slide it over the studs, put it back in the truck, bolt it back together the way you took it apart, and then you're good to go. But what we're going to do is try to install the two-piece lift kit. We'll take this whole assembly apart and try to do it. So you want to compress your spring as much as you can until you start to see the shock become loose. Last thing you want to do is shoot yourself in the face with a spring. So once you get to that position, it's a 21 millimeter top nut. You can use a wrench, you can use an angled impact if you want to. Go ahead and take that off to free the shock. So once you have the shock disassembled, all you're trying to do is get the spring seat to come off. There is a cap on the seal head. You just have to use the spring seat just to pop it off slightly. Remove the entire spring seat assembly. Drop in your new spacer. Just slides on. Put back on your spring seat. The cap. It's good to go. Now you put it back in the truck. You can orient the logo how you want to once it's in the vehicle. Always keep in mind that these shocks are side specific. If you notice on this shock, the reservoirs are canted a specific way. That means it'll be either passenger or driver to move away from the front axles. Make sure you don't mix these up. On the Colorado, you can actually put it in with it being wrong, but on the Silverado, it won't even allow you to get it in place. But just keep that in mind when you're putting the stuff back together. Go back to your spring compressor, rebuild the entire assembly, and then put it back in the truck. The next thing I recommend is you keep it loose as much as you can. Use the same impact you took it off with. Hold the shock doesn't move. Tighten that till you can, until you get enough threads. Put spring pressure back onto the top mount, and then you can do your final tightening on the top shock. So that your assembly is finished, you'll put it back in the vehicle just the way you took it out. Make sure everything's torque, and you'll be good to go. So the first thing you're going to do on the control arm removal, you'll take out the 10 mil holding the brake lines and the wheel speed sensor in place. This is what's going to zip tie to that tab on the new control arms. The next thing you'll want to do is remove the control arm bolts. They are 21 millimeter both sides, so use a socket on one end and a wrench on the other, and just start to loosen them to free them up. Get both sides lifted out, just pull out the arm. Next thing you want to do is just take a little dab of silicone, put it on the end of your circ fittings, stick it inside your control arm. And this is a 10 millimeter, just go ahead and tighten it in. In order to mount the aftermarket control arms, you're gonna have to go ahead and get rid of the droop stop here. So we're gonna go ahead and cut this, touch it up with some black paint to make sure it doesn't rust, and then install the arms. Okay, next thing you wanna do, get your control arms up into place. Try to line up the holes as best you can. You'll probably have to adjust it slightly to get the holes to go through. Next, you'll take your supplied washers, put on the outside of the control arm, add your nut. Now that you reach this point, you're gonna put the assembly back in the truck just the way you had it before. So you notice your misalignment spacers and your taper bolt are slightly different than before. The order in which they come in is the order that it goes in the control arm. So you're gonna start with loosening the whole thing. So you'll start with the top, drop it into place, make sure the spacer is aligned. Bring up the bottom spacer here. This is the part that's gonna go into the spindle. Once you put the bolt through the spindle, go ahead and add the washer and the nut from the bottom. We're using a 7/8 wrench, 15 mil socket. Next thing you want to do is make sure you zip tie your brake line wheel speed sensor assembly to the control arm. There's a little notch here that you can either take a piece of pliers, just bend it flat. That way you can sit this flush on top with a zip tie. Just drop the zip tie all the way through it and zip tie it to the arm. Next, you want to reinstall your wheel speed sensor clips with those 10 millimeters we took out earlier. Again, make sure that you're using a socket on these, not an impact, because the aluminum on the spindle will pull the threads right out. And then your wheel speed sensor towards the bottom. Just until it's snug. Same with the bottom. Next, we'll reinstall our tie rod back into the spindle. This was with a 21 millimeter nut. Go ahead and put that back on there. You can use an impact on this one. Remember your 18 millimeter top nuts, go ahead and start tightening those. And then finally, your two 15 millimeter bolts on the shock and your 18 millimeter on the sway bar end link. Go ahead and tighten those. So now we have our completed assembly, our control arms installed. Go through with the torque wrench and torque everything to factory specs. We'll have those uploaded on the website as well for you. Once you have that done, you want to do a quick road test, come back, check all the bolts again, and take it in for an alignment. Thanks for watching.